Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So today we're going to venture into a new application of Amazed and Perplexed. And so to set up our thinking, we want to process this question. So right now, Connor, what genre speaks to you? So that could be literature or, plays or movies or whatever, but what really speaks to you right now and like resonates with you where you're at?
So I love this question because it's so varied. And I used to think about it in terms of like, oh, you're a big fan of like of fiction, you're a big fan of horror, you're a big fan of comedy, like that's along those lines. And I think that is what we're talking about here. But I was hearing somebody talk about the other day about why they loved D&D. Now I know that like for some Christians that could Dungeons and Dragons could raise quite a few hackles from back in the day.
They just shut us off.
They just shut us off.
We're out.
But this person was telling me about how the being planted into a story for them, becoming part of the story, making decisions, being a part of this grand quest adventure that they're going on, it just really does something for them, and it's restorative to their soul to be able to detach from their current reality, but still engage, still commune with other people. And for them, that was it. And it's funny because I've had similar experiences with like video games and that sort of thing, and I just want to draw those out because I know for a lot of people, it's like, man, what good could video games have? What good do these other things have? But yeah, I've seen a lot of beauty in that. But for me specifically, I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, which might surprise some people. But for me, the thing that's really been speaking to me is the kind of sci-fi to fantasy genre. There's something about the process. Sci-fi obviously is usually looking forward to different technologies that humans make or come into contact with, and how the human race will interact with these new dynamics at play, these new revelations, how these new things so much of the time bring about these old ways of thinking, these old ways of doing things. And same sort of thing with fantasy. Now, usually it's it's usually set in the past, and there's this for me that there's this really helpful thing that I just always keep coming back to about the idea of casting my mind to the future and casting my mind kind of back to the past, and even with a mystical, magical element to it. Man, that just does something for me that helps me take in deeper stories. So like you think about the Chronicles of Narnia or Lord of the Rings, and two Christians who write these stories, and the Chronicles of Narnia is very overt kind of Christian themes, and J.R.R. Tolkien hated that. He didn't like how overt it was, but his story has these allegorical things that can relate back to creation and relate back to the God he believed in. And so for me, these big overarching ideas that we process as people, for me, when I see them played out in this genre, it just really speaks to me. I like that, and I like that the deeper. Sometimes people don't question, you like what you like. But I when I was 9, I read my first X-Men comic book, and I mean, I know where I was. It's like, people say, where were you at 9/11 or whatever? And I don't mean to draw a parallel. I'm just saying I remember clearly the room I was in and what I was doing and why I just came up with a great sermon idea for you. You might have done it already, but you start off talking about this moment, you set the scene, and people are going to assume that you'd be like, and I opened the Bible and I saw Jesus, and you set it all up for the punchline of, and it was X-Men comic, whatever it was.
Right. And at that time in the storyline, and man, you don't want me to go as deep as I want to right now, but bottom line, the whole premise of the X-Men is here's all these people that outside of this context, their giftedness was misunderstood. And maybe not trusted or not used for the common good kind of thing. And that really resonated with me. I felt really lost, and I felt really like, what do I have to offer kind of thing. And I'm not suggesting I read the book thinking that, but now in retro, and the team dynamic, I find I really resist leading stuff by myself. If there's any way I can lead in team, I will always go that direction, even maybe to my own detriment or the organization's detriment. And I just love that dynamic of team and how they could switch out people, and their problem solving was never because they were all powerful. it was always because they found a new way to get it done, and it usually required teamwork, And that, I love that, in contrast to like a Superman dynamic where Superman just comes in and hits it hard enough or whatever. But this was team, and it was almost always in their collaboration, not just in their uniqueness. And because as an adult, I'm like, you kind of want to justify reading kid literature,
Sure.
Which I know it's taken a whole new feel. Like, this is pre-movies, so it wasn't near as cool.
Pre-cool.
Yeah, pre-cool. So it wasn't something I talk to people about usually. But in retrospect, I was like, I do that in real life. Like, I look for collaboration. I long for people's giftedness to show up, and then we can value it and encourage it.
I love what you had to say there. And I think the thing that I'm always interested in, as an observer of people and just somebody who wants to see more and more people, just come into contact with Jesus. You see the trends in like the broader society. We'll just talk about America. And over the past 10 years, although now it kind of seems to be fading, the love of superheroes and the love of Marvel and just like the cult following that hundreds of millions of people just have really adapted to. And I've always been bothered that so many Christians, whether it was like Harry Potter back in the day, or whether I think even about like 5-6 years ago, there was like whenever, what was that? Game of Thrones was really big, like these massive shows, and there's always these massive content, and there's always this urge to go and look at all the negatives and look at all the things, and there are certainly things that you should not be watching and should not be consuming. But as a follower of Jesus who wants to know people better, I'm always wanting to ask myself the question of, okay, why are they so invested? Like, what is it about this horrible TV show and that is drawing people in? Not so that I can like get them to stop watching it, but just so I can understand what hole the show is filling that they're not seeing elsewhere. And so I love this conversation, and it's one of those things when we talk about the Bible, we tend to view it as like at least for me, I felt like I was taught like the Bible was just the rule book. It was the verbatim. God just took a moment in heaven and was like, hey, we're gonna jot down all my thoughts exactly, and this is what the Word of God is, and it's all the same, and it's all like you take every word means the exact same thing in every context that you find it in. And we know that that's not true. We know through our study through 𝐏𝐬𝐚 and Perplexed that God wants to use all these different genres. He wants to use all these methods of storytelling. And it's one of the more beautiful aspects, I think, of the Bible, that when you go, like there are aspects, we're going to talk about the Psalms. When you look at the Old Testament, there are these aspects of history that are being recorded. There's history of a people being recorded. There's mythical elements. There's poetry, like we're going to talk about now. There's dare I say erotic poetry in the Song of Solomon. I mean, just when we talked a lot about in the parables, there's fiction. There's all these methods that God is using to communicate his love for his people and his grand story. And it's one of those things that we always want to draw back on, that, man, I'm really drawn to this one thing. I'm really drawn to this way of telling a story. And those are good, awesome things, and we want to lean into them. And God knows that about us. And so God is gracious enough to give us these different ways of hearing, of hearing from him.
Absolutely right. And I think that it's really important, and why we're talking about this. If the word genre doesn't speak to you, basically we're just talking about a category of artistic expression. I'll give you a good example. Genesis would be a narrative. Exodus would be a narrative genre. It's telling a story of people, and there's plot, and there's climatic moments and these kind of things. Leviticus, on the other hand, is really, in many ways, the only book that is pure rules. Mm-hmm. And that pertained to the people that lived under the Old Covenant. So though there are aspects that are restated for us, those of us live in the New Covenant, those are not our rules. They were very specific for those people in time. And then you get to something like Proverbs, which is, they kind of lump them together, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Psalms, as wisdom literature. But even the difference between Proverbs, which are statements that are, some of them are proscriptive and some are descriptive. In other words, when in the Proverbs he says, it's better to sit on the edge of a roof than be in your house with a wife that's upset with you, he's not suggesting that's the ideal life. Mm-hmm. But then there are others that are proscriptive, where he's like, hey, seek wisdom and do this kind of thing. So they're just wisdom things to understand life, whereas the Psalms are poetry. And I'm not a big poetry person, but I've had enough exposure to know, for example, the statement, roses are red, violets are blue. well, that's not true. If R means always, because there are white roses and pink roses, this kind of thing. And so we understand you can't draw science from roses are red, violets are blue, and then you say, well, everything that's not red is not a rose, or everything that is red is a rose, And so I think we almost intuitively understand that when I'm reading poetry, I don't hold it to the same standard as law or the same standard even as narrative of telling a story. Like the Gospels are narrative, Acts is a narrative, but when you get to the letters, now you have this very specific communication. So there's all these different genres, and of course, books like certainly sections of Ezekiel and Daniel, and of course, all of Revelation is a vision, so that's prophetic or apocalyptic literature. And so it's just important when we're reading these to take a moment to say, what is this? So as we dig into the Psalms, and we don't know how this is going to go. It's like the parables. It's like when we did Philippians. We just keep praying and asking God. And so we're going to start with Psalm 1 this week, and maybe we'll do Psalm 2 next week, or maybe we'll do something totally different. But we wanted just to apply the approach of Amazed and Perplexed to this.
And I think I think I loved your example of roses are red, violets are blue, and what is the purpose of somebody when they use that phrase, they use that poem template to say something. They're trying to describe, they're trying to quantify something that science can't quantify. They're trying to quantify something that you can't formulaically figure out what it is. You can't relate it directly to the senses necessarily. And so that's why the poems are so important. That's why they're so that's why the Psalms are so important. That's why poems are really big. I'm not a big poetry guy myself, but when you look at a lot of what's going on here is we can read the static realities of who God says he is in the Old Testament, but when we see people actually trying to quantify what it is to be a follower of Yahweh, what it's like to live life under him, and what it's like to feel like he's not there, a lot of times what these psalmists are after, it's trying to put into words what can't be described in a A plus B equals C sort of way, and so in that that's going to make some people uncomfortable, and it's going to make some people really excited, and so I'm excited to see what happens.
Absolutely. So if you'll join me, we'll read Psalm 1. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. Yeah, so what really jumps out at me is, and it's kind of a 1-2 punch. I guess 1 is the thing that amazes me, and 2 is a caveat, I guess is better said. But the thing is, I look at the world as a million different, and this frames the world as 2. And you could even, I can understand if somebody would read this and say, well, how cold he is to the wicked. And that's kind of the caveat I'll speak to in a second. But it's just so clarifying, because when I walk into a room subconsciously, and I know this not by self-monitoring, but by all the science that's out there, you immediately assess the room, like a room full of people, and you immediately move to who you're most comfortable with. And that may be in a perception of who you're most like. And that doesn't mean like in the sense of you look like or necessarily. It could be there's a vibe, you know what I mean, or whatever. So because it's subconscious, you just move there. And so, but in even doing that, you're assessing this person's different, this person's different, and there's a million differences. And this, to sum it up, they're the same. And in the sense that they're the same in what is ultimately important, and that amazes me to have that kind of clarity. The caveat is, and I would say this, and maybe this is just my fear coming up, is the dynamic of, this is not necessarily predetermined. This is a choice that exists in front of. I get to choose whether I'm going to be lumped in with the wicked or lumped in with the righteous. At least that's the way I see this, is because this is, it's funny. It's the first Psalm, and I don't know if God's like, usually I start with something that's going to grab people's attention.
Yeah.
And the clarity, but I see it as a choice. And that's my bias,
Sure.
because I'm kind of tying in grace to this. So maybe that's not fair, but just that idea of it's a simple choice for me too. It seems really complicated because life is so complicated and we're so struck with sin and tempted by the devil. But at the end of the day, it's like, do I choose him or do I not?
Yeah, man, I think that's really helpful because I'm very much the same way, and we've talked about a lot before this idea that, man, we start thinking about all these different ways that all the different gray areas, all the different caveats that we can make, and you can take something that's very simple, man, I'm going to choose God today, or I'm not going to choose God today, and okay, well, what does that look like? Okay, well, if 8 a.m. I had this thing, and then 9 p.m. Now, you just keep going down the list, and it just keeps blowing up and blowing up and blowing up, and eventually, man, you feel like this very simple thing is now this just super complex web of things. And for me, I'm the picture that it's painting for me here is like, I'm just wondering, is this something that I need to speak over my soul when I feel that complex of like, when I feel like, because life is complex and following God is not an easy path. Being a disciple of Jesus is not easy. But the thing that I need to keep coming back to is, man, there's a simple choice here. Yeah, it diverges and it can be complicated, but ultimately it comes back to this original choice. Yeah. So for me, I'm really amazed. I'm amazed at his example of what a righteous person looks like. A tree that's planted by water that's producing fruit, and I'm just. Yeah, I'm just fascinated by that picture of there have been many times in my life, man, where my walk with God, or even moments in my day where my walk with God feels like that, when I can go like, man, like I woke up, I chose love today. I didn't, as a kid say, I didn't choose violence. I chose to be kind and caring to my coworkers. I chose to go above and beyond. At work, I came home, I was reflective. I was caring for my spouse, and I'm engaged with my kid at just all the levels I can be. And then, like, at those moments, I just feel like this, like, man, I feel like I'm on the firm rock. I'm a tree planted where my roots just run so deep. And that image of, man, when I'm truly living in that, of actually being in that. Because so often in time when I am, man, following the path of righteousness, when I feel like I'm really diving in and submitting and, going this way, I don't usually reflect on it too much. Like, I usually am not like, let me take a moment here and process. It's only after like I've, been uprooted, or it's only after something comes along that, chops off a big branch, where I'm like, oh man, 2 weeks ago, that was such a peaceful moment. There was such a peaceful moment when I was a tree by the brook. Poetry is so funny. So yeah, this whole thing is so amazing to me. And so perplexing, because I think, so the perplexing part for me is like, and that maybe this is going to get to weird, uncomfortable categories, but I really want to rewrite this. Like, I want to, I want to have this be said something else. Like, I think about, like, the image that just came up into my mind, and this is me attempting, not poetry, but some sort of, imagery to help you, is I feel like so often, man, I'm following God. I'm being a disciple of him. And it's like, I'm an anchor on a ship, and, if you know anything about ships, and I know 0.1% of anything about ships, so I don't know anything, but I do know that you can't stop on a dime on a ship, and so eventually you have to like let your anchor down, and it's going to catch on something, and eventually you're going to stop. And for me, man, that feels like, man, when I am firm, like, it feels like I so often the time, like when I'm not following God, when I'm following this path of wickedness, or when I'm allowing, man, the wicked nature of the world to really whip me around, it's like I'm that anchor that hasn't got stopped yet by something. I'm the anchor that hasn't allowed myself to be, caught and held taut. And so that, for me, the perplexing thing is just like, is I want more wiggle room in this. And I think there is some wiggle room in other areas. And so this is a psalm, like we talked, this is poetry. But I'd love to talk through the psalmist and be like, hey, what was the other imagery that you wanted to use here?
The other metaphors. Yeah. That is fascinating. That ties into what perplexes me is that picture, and the one you referenced about, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. My first impression is, I may not be righteous, because I feel like I look around and I don't know if I'm bearing any fruit, And keep in mind, I'm a minister at a church that I think is healthy, and I'm surrounded by some of the best people in the world. Literally, to me, I think they're some of the best people in the world. That being said, I constantly struggle with, is this enough? Is it worth it? Like, should I just move on? Like, this dynamic. And I had a person call me one time. I'd done a retreat, and they messaged me a month later and like, I'm really discouraged. Can you tell me some of the things God's doing in your world? And I was like, man, yeah. So I listed 2 or 3 examples, specifically that were really exciting. Within 6 months, all 3 of those blew up. Like, I don't even know where those people are anymore. Like, several left the state. One of them just started talking trash about me. Like, it was really a weird deal, and we had to have a intervention meeting. It was just rough. And I'm like, well, there's my fruit, And if you've been in ministry in any way, and not professional, just, where you really want good for somebody and you're like, I think Jesus led me here, it's likely, if you've done it very long, that you're like, what was that worth? Like, what happened there? And the tendency is to say, I must be messed up. And my saving grace is or I didn't do it well enough. What I mean? At least that's one of the options there, And even though you look at Jesus and you're like, looks like he really messed up, because at the 0 hour, everybody leaves. One guy flat betrays him. One guy totally, denies him, and it's hard to have the long view because we only know this millisecond, but it is that dynamic of, and I think in season kind of saves my brain, because I don't know what the seasons are in God's, annual year, which 1,000 years is like a day, and the kind of thing is that, and there are seasons where I'm like, wow, look what God did, but there are a lot of times, and I'm sure you know how this is. It's like what you were saying. When things are going well, I hardly notice it. I'm just enjoying it. But things go bad, I'm like, oh man, I see where I got off track now, and I don't remember. You've got to really force yourself to remember the good,
man. So there's something that you said there just sparked this in my mind, and this might just be such a duh sort of thing for me, for everyone else, and it's just a complete revolution in my mind. But I've always assumed that the fruit that I produce would look and taste as good forever. And so what I mean by that, when we think about the term, like we think about the idea of fruit, like fruit is something, it's finite in a moment, and it happens, and it's meant to be consumed, it's meant to be enjoyed, it's meant to be relished in.
Wow.
And it's meant for the moment. You don't produce fruit for 10 years from now. You don't produce fruit for 15 years from now. And so, man, I'm just thinking right now is like, has my idea of what my fruit is, man, like I just feel like it just reinforces our idea. Man, it reinforces the thing that we've talked about so often, is that God is the God of the moment, here and now. And so the fruit that I'm producing, like you look at the story of Jesus and all the things we talk about, man, that's not good. Hindsight, that fruit looks not very good. It looks rotten sometimes. It looks like there's some fruit flies around it. But then I go, man, that fruit, was that the fruit, for them then now? Was that, man, just complete? Complete. Was it the juiciest strawberry, the juiciest blueberry, whatever dumb fruit you want to talk about? And I'm honestly kind of flustered because this is something that I'm just starting to come to terms with. I think
I needed that today. I really did, because I think that is so true, and it's consistent with the Bible. It was God leading. Pick the person. Was God leading Miriam? Man, Miriam is leading this beautiful praise of slaves that have been in slavery their entire life. Had they ever done praise before? And now she's leading them in praise. But then there are other times you're like, please don't record anything about me. You know what I mean? And and everybody, Moses is like, man, he's a lawgiver, is fantastic. Or Elijah, he's this prophet, and it's making the pastorate kind of thing. And then you're like, and then he's running away and he's doing these things. Well, was God leading him then? Yeah, God was. He was very human. He struggled. But God was like, okay, I'll take what you give me. And the way that fruit shows up, I've never thought about that application of in season. I've always thought this will eventually look good perpetually, but you're exactly right. He chose, this goes to what metaphor was also in his mind, and the Spirit moved him, because David had the Spirit, of course. The Spirit moved him to use this metaphor, but that is really amazing. You know what I mean? And there's sometimes good trees for whatever reason. Maybe they're a little bit sick or whatever, but they produce bad fruit. And then when they're tended to, they produce good fruit. And that'd be an interesting thing to think about the fig tree and all that, you know what I mean? But the point in all this is, and at the end of the day, when I have good fruit, do I trust God? Will I trust God? And when I have bad fruit, will I trust God? Because faithfulness is not performance. Faithfulness is trusting God. And that's and I know that really at the core of who I am, and forget at the instant trouble comes.
So that's fascinating. I have I think I've talked about it before on the podcast. I have a really tall avocado tree in the back of our house, and I think it's almost 7 feet now. It's really tall. I've got grow lights. People who walk in our backyard might think I'm have a marijuana plants back there. I mean, I do, but no, I'm just kidding. But so recently I just spaced, crazy things were happening, and I forgot to water for a week and a half. So I walked back there and all the leaves were dead. I mean, all the leaves at the top were dead. And so I've done it before. I'm not the best, plant owner, arborist, whatever. And so I had to go in there and to do that. It looked so sad. Maybe I'll take a picture of it and post it as part of the podcast. It is so gross looking. And I've done it before and it's come back and survived, but you have to go and cut off all the leaves and all the dead branches because so the tree won't continue to send nutrients to these dead limbs. And so for me, I think about the process of now that's a bad example because I wasn't being noticeable of it. But even when you have a good plant, when you have a good plant that's producing stuff, you still have to go about the process of pruning. You still have to go about the process of what you would see as subtracting or having the hard times or having the unfruitful times. And it's one of those things we all if you've planted anything. And you've planted, you've watered, you sowed, you did all this stuff. You feel like you got it all right, but then you're that moment until you see the first seedling pop up and then, okay, the seedling happened, until you see the fruit actually begin to grow, you're still questioning, was all this work worth anything? Was this all, is this all going to come to anything? Is it all a part of anything? And so I think that's another thing that's very helpful for me in this idea is we don't know, we won't know that we are in the season that God has called us to produce fruit until the fruit is actually happening. Mm-hmm. And again, it's not a one-to-one comparison scientific thing, but I think for me that rings very true.
This morning I was with a group that I could speak really openly with and speak very honestly with, and just a real privilege there. And when I checked in with that group, I shared some pretty raw stuff just about my sense of, who I am as a minister and this kind of thing. And later on in that conversation, somebody in their effort to encourage me said, man, I've experienced that before, and I'm really sorry, for that, and I'm really excited, because God's not wasting your time, basically. And my initial response is, shut your mouth. That was my initial response. Don't tell me you know how I feel, Mm-hmm. But as it was like this, using the framing of Psalm 1, as I had this choice, and these are in milliseconds, but I had this choice, am I going to step into righteousness, which means submission, like you were talking earlier, and say, okay, God, what do you have for me? I want to receive it here. Or do I step into my self-absorption and defensiveness, which eventually is participating in wickedness, And that's the thing about life is it's a lot of millisecond choices. We think of the big choice because often we think of the big mistakes, but you didn't just make a big mistake. There was a lot of mistakes. Let's reframe that. There's a lot of giving into temptation that led to the big giving into temptation, and we set ourselves up for future failure by treating temptation like it's not a big deal when nobody knows about it. You know what I mean? But I think it's the same way we set ourselves up for acts of faith by trusting in these small things and choosing, and righteousness, and this is, maybe we should have dove into that earlier, but righteousness biblically, especially under Christ, so I'm trying to figure out how would they have experienced it. But righteousness, God made him who had no sin to become righteousness for us, or take on our sin, rather died for our sin, so that we might become his righteousness. Righteousness is found in trusting God. It's not in right behavior. And that's the dynamic he's saying there. When you choose righteousness, it's not just making the right choice, because a lot of times we don't know what the right choice would be. Sometimes it's clear, but a lot of times it's not. It's stepping in and saying, God, I know you've got this. I'm going to trust you with this. I want to be aligned with you in this. And that's that moving towards righteousness.
Yeah, and I think you've talked a lot. It's this.
What? I've talked a lot.
No, you talked about this on another line in this passage in this the psalm when it talks about meditating on the law day and night. And it's the same sort of idea of, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And you brought this up many times, but it's this idea of, man, I am using every moment that I can to turn back to God, to connect with him. I'm using every moment that I can be present in, that I can love in, that I can choose the path of righteousness, that I can choose to dwell in the safety of God, dwell in the mystery of God, dwell in his righteousness. Man, that is a big picture of what it looks like to meditate on the law of God daily. And that's how that's what you're talking about here. Is like, it's that that's what you're talking about here. Is it's not just a one-time decision. It's not one big declaration. It's over the course of time, small moments where you're continually choosing to meditate on the law of God, choosing to rest in the goodness and the righteousness of who God is to all of us. Thank you for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. We thought this was really cool. At least I thought it was really cool. We haven't debriefed on it, but I'm really encouraged by it. And so if this is something that you really liked, you can, if it's something you really liked or something that we said, man, really stuck out to you, you can get into contact with us by going to our website, amazedandperplexed.com. Or if you just want to shoot us a text or an email or whatever, we'd love to hear your thoughts, your criticisms. Maybe not the criticisms. It'll depend. I'll let you know if I'm having you text me and you let me know if you ask me if I can handle criticism that day, and I'll be honest with you if I need the win or not. So anyways, we'd appreciate your feedback.
Grace, peace, and love.